Fletcher Tabata.
Thank you for the opportunity to speak on this bill, and I do commend the member who has put this forward. And I have to go back a couple of contributions from that side of the House to acknowledge Mr Retty and his considered debate in the House tonight, and an analysis of actual detail. How refreshing from that side of the House, instead of being told how complicated it is, how broad it is, and something about supply chains, Mr Bennett. Beautiful. You picked that up really well. Look, Mr Speaker, let's just look at some of the facts here. And so what I want to do is acknowledge Mr Retty's contribution and take some of the wording from the Tariff Act 1930 from the US and its recent update. And let's see what the US is trying to do. Forced labour, as herein used, shall mean all work or service which is exacted from any person under the menace of any penalty for its non-performance and for which the worker does not offer himself or herself voluntarily. What a definition. What a great place to start for the member who spoke prior to come to Select Committee and say, actually, what Mr Henare has in his legislation may not be on the money, but look at the precedent from around the world of countries who have acknowledged that this is a problem. And in fact, just Mr Retty's contribution was so good, it belied the fact that there are specific solutions, there are specific attempts, and yes, they are complicated, but that is not a reason, it is absolutely not a reason to not support sensible legislation to combat slave labour, Mr Speaker. Look, New Zealand First, as you can tell, supports this legislation. And New Zealand has been an advocate for labour rights for most of its history. And in fact, what was it? It was just last week that we had the forum launched, the New Zealand Business and Human Rights Group come and speak in Parliament and use the facilities. And it was at that forum's launch that I quote, "New Zealand businesses are increasingly recognising that respecting human rights is not only the right thing to do, it's also good for business." Mr Speaker, this bill should be unanimously passed tonight because I do concede the point around definition and where do we proceed from here, but we need legislation to begin that battle, to encompass the efforts of the WTO trade agreements, and actually I'll go to some of them. For example, and let's not confuse the issue here, New Zealand First completely opposes the TPA because it's a bad trade deal, but in it at least the US was trying, and I quote, to work towards the highest standard, most progressive work standards in history. It's got strong enforceable provisions for workers preventing things like child labour. It's got strong enforceable provisions on the environment, helping us do things to protect people. The United States is seeking an enforceable labour obligation that would require countries to uphold international labour standards in their laws and practices as reflected in the 1998 International Labour Organisation Declaration, and Mr Retty spoke to that. So we have a framework, we have something to begin the debate, and this House, this Parliament, needs to bring it into legislation to make it meaningful, to make it binding on the House so that we can look after not only workers in New Zealand, but protect businesses here and look after people from around the world. Thank you, Mr Speaker.
Paul Foster-Bell.